The rain lashed against the clinic's grimy windows, a relentless drumbeat that mirrored Nora Thorne's exhaustion. Each drop seemed to carry the weight of her 26 years, every single one of them feeling like a burden. The charity clinic was a beacon of hope for so many, but for Nora it was simply a place where she poured every last ounce of herself, only to feel emptier at the end of each long, underpaid shift. Burnout was a dull ache behind her eyes, a constant companion. She tugged her threadbare cardigan tighter, the chill in the old building seeping into her bones. Her cheap, unreliable car waited in the alley, another daily struggle she'd have to face. Lately, the anxiety felt worse, a low thrum beneath her skin, a constant reminder of the stalker ex who still somehow managed to haunt her periphery, even after she'd moved across town. Sometimes, in her deepest, most private thoughts, Nora yearned for a world where someone, anyone, would simply take care of her, a silent guardian against the relentless tide of life. But such dreams felt foolish, naive. Pushing open the heavy back door, the roar of the New Orleans storm swallowed her. Rain instantly plastered her hair to her face, soaking her thin clothes. The alley was a dark, swirling tunnel of water and shadows. She almost didn't see him. Huddled against the brick wall, beneath a rusted fire escape, was a man. He was a ragged heap, shivering violently, his clothes soaked through, utterly indistinguishable from the puddles that surrounded him. He looked unwell, barely conscious, his head lolling against the grimy bricks. A flicker of self-preservation, a whisper of caution, urged Nora to hurry past. This was a dangerous city, and she was alone. But the sight of his vulnerability, his obvious suffering, pierced through her weariness. It was an instinct, a core part of her, that she couldn't ignore. Her hand instinctively went to her bag, pulling out the last styrofoam takeout box from her lunch, a half-eaten sandwich and a few stray fries. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. "Hey," she said softly, crouching down, ignoring the cold water seeping into her jeans. "Are you okay? Do you want this?" The man didn't respond immediately, but his head lifted slowly, his eyes dark and shadowed, fixing on her. He didn't look like the usual street dwellers she encountered. There was something in their depths, even through the haze of apparent illness, that seemed to hold an intelligence that unsettled her. Still, compassion won. She gently pushed the takeout box into his trembling hands. "It's not much, but it's warm." She reached out, her fingers brushing his arm, trying to convey a moment of human kindness, a connection in the storm. Just as her hand touched his, the alley erupted. It wasn't a natural sound. It was a sudden, violent cacophony of shouts, breaking glass, and the sharp crack of what sounded like gunshots echoing off the narrow walls. Figures, dark and menacing, swarmed into the alley from both ends. This wasn't random. This was an ambush, brutal and swift, clearly meant for the man she had just tried to help. Nora cried out, scrambling back, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was caught in the crossfire, a helpless bystander in a sudden, terrifying war. One of the figures, moving with chilling precision, lunged towards the man she had fed. In the chaos, something small and sharp struck Nora's neck, a fleeting prick that felt like a bee sting, followed by a strange, sweet smell. Her vision blurred, the world tilting precariously. Her last conscious thought, as her knees buckled and darkness threatened to swallow her whole, was of the man she had offered food. His eyes, fixed on her through the rain and the violence, were no longer vacant or weak. They were sharp, dangerous, and searingly focused, radiating a lethal intent that sent a tremor of primal fear through her. In that fleeting moment, she saw not a beggar, but something ancient and powerful, a true, terrifying nature unleashed. Then the world went black. A soft, unfamiliar light filtered through heavy velvet drapes, chasing away the absolute blackness that had claimed Nora. She blinked, her eyelids heavy, a dull throb behind her temples. The scent in the air was rich, something deep and woody, utterly unlike the antiseptic tang of the clinic or the stale air of her own cramped apartment. Slowly, she became aware of her surroundings. She lay in a bed of incredible softness, silk sheets cool against her skin. The mattress beneath her seemed to swallow her whole. The room itself was vast, draped in dark, opulent fabrics, heavy mahogany furniture gleaming in the dim light. A grand Gothic mansion, she realized with a jolt. Not a hospital, not her home, not anywhere she had ever been. Panic, cold and sharp, began to claw at her throat. Terror seized her, a suffocating fear that stole her breath. What had happened? Where was she? A soft click echoed in the large room, and the heavy door eased open. Nora's gaze snapped to it, her heart hammering against her ribs. A silhouette filled the doorway, tall and imposing, then stepped into the room. It was the man from the alley, but he was no longer a shivering, ragged beggar. He was impeccably dressed in a dark suit that seemed to melt into the shadows, tailored to perfection, emphasizing the breadth of his shoulders, the lean power of his frame. His hair was slicked back, dark as midnight, and his eyes, no longer hazed by feigned illness, were piercing, utterly focused on her. Gabriel Knight. The name resonated in her mind, though she couldn't recall ever hearing it before. The air in the room seemed to thicken with his presence, charged with an almost tangible power that made her feel impossibly small. He moved with an unnerving grace, stopping at the foot of the bed, his gaze never leaving her face. "You're awake!" His voice rumbled, deep and resonant, a sound that vibrated through her, demanding attention. It was a voice of command, not a question. "Good." Nora tried to speak, but her throat was dry and only a weak croak escaped. She pulled the silk sheets tighter around her, a futile attempt at shielding herself. "There's no need to be afraid, Nora," he continued, taking a slow step closer. "Though I understand why you might be confused." His eyes, dark as obsidian, seemed to see right through her. "The man you helped last night was me. The ambush was real, though not entirely unexpected. It was a test of compassion for the clinic workers. You, Nora Thorne, passed." "A test?" Her mind reeled. The idea was monstrous, cruel, yet a strange, cold logic settled over her. This man, this formidable, dangerous man, had been watching. And she, in her simple act of kindness, had been chosen. He closed the distance to the bedside, his height towering over her even as she sat propped against the pillows. His hand, large and strong, lifted into her line of sight. On the back, a rosary tattoo, intricate and dark, stood out against his skin. It was a symbol of faith, perhaps, but on him it felt like a declaration of power, of ancient loyalties. "Because you were present," he explained, his voice losing none of its commanding edge. "Because your face is now known to my enemies, the same enemies who ambushed me, the trafficking ring I've been hunting. You are now a target. Unacceptable." He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly, and Nora felt a shiver trace down her spine. "To protect you, to ensure your absolute safety, I have claimed you. You are my wife, Nora. Our marriage has been arranged." Nora gasped, a choked sound of disbelief. Wife? Marriage? It was impossible, insane. She was a nurse, not some prize to be claimed. Yet, beneath the terror, a strange, almost dizzying sense of relief washed over her. The words were terrifying, possessive, a blatant taking of her autonomy. But his voice, his presence, promised an absolute, unshakable protection. It was the very thing she had secretly yearned for, a shield against the relentless world. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small, dark velvet collar necklace. It was simple, elegant yet deeply symbolic. He lifted it, his gaze holding hers captive. "This," he said, his fingers brushing the soft fabric, "is a symbol, of your new status, of my protection, and of your belonging to me." He leaned closer, his scent, rich and masculine, filling her senses. She held her breath, unable to move, unable to look away. His large, warm hands gently parted her hair at the nape of her neck. The cold metal of the clasp, then the soft, yielding velvet, settled against her skin. It wasn't tight, not uncomfortable, but it was undeniably there, a constant presence. It felt like a tether, a claim. Nora felt bewildered, her mind struggling to process the enormity of his words, of his actions. He was a mafia king. He had staged a test. He had kidnapped her, and now he had declared her his wife. This should have filled her with pure, unadulterated outrage. Yet, as his hand lingered at her neck, a strange calm settled over her. His authority, dark and absolute, was terrifying, but it was also a promise. She was his, and in that terrifying, exhilarating truth, she felt an undeniable, profound sense of safety. A part of her, the part that had always been weary and alone, yielded to him, to his will, to his frightening, powerful protection. The next morning, Nora woke to the soft hiss of a shower in an adjoining room. The silk sheets, the heavy drapes, the sheer size of the opulent bedroom, all crashed over her again, a stark and terrifying reality. She was no longer Nora Thorne, overworked nurse. She was his, Gabriel Knight's claimed wife. The velvet collar necklace, a silent, weighty presence at her throat, confirmed it. He emerged from the bathroom moments later, a towel slung low on his lean hips, droplets clinging to his dark hair and the powerful expanse of his chest. His presence filled the room, making it feel smaller, making her feel minuscule. Nora instinctively pulled the sheets higher, her gaze unable to tear away from him. He didn't seem to notice her modesty, or perhaps he simply didn't care. His eyes, dark and unwavering, met hers. "Breakfast will be brought to you," he stated, his voice a low rumble that settled deep in her bones, a command disguised as information. He walked to a vast mahogany wardrobe, pulling out clothes with an easy, practiced motion. "You will not leave this room without one of my men. You will not attempt to contact anyone outside these walls without my express approval. Your old life, Nora, is gone." Her breath caught in her throat. The words were a hammer blow, robbing her of any last illusion of freedom. No leaving, no contact. She was a prisoner, albeit one in a gilded cage. But then he turned, his gaze sweeping over her, and a strange, almost dizzying wave of something akin to safety washed over her. His words, though absolute, were delivered with an unshakable certainty, a promise that he would handle everything. The thought was both terrifying and, to a weary part of her soul, deeply appealing. Later, a silent woman brought a tray laden with food, fresh fruit, delicate pastries, rich coffee. Nora ate slowly, her senses overwhelmed by the luxury, the stark contrast to her hurried, often skipped meals at the clinic. She still felt disoriented, her mind struggling to reconcile the gentle life she'd led with the ruthless power of the man who now commanded her existence. She tried to explore, venturing tentatively into the adjoining sitting room, a space even larger and more lavish than the bedroom. Every corner of the mansion exuded an ancient, formidable wealth, a stark opposition to her own gentle nature. Yet everywhere she went, she felt a watchful presence. Men in dark suits, silent and unsmiling, seemed to materialize and disappear, their eyes always tracking her, always vigilant. It was unnerving, a constant reminder of her captivity, but also, paradoxically, a strange comfort. They were his men, and they were here to protect her. Gabriel himself was a force of nature. He moved through the mansion like a king in his domain, his commands crisp and unquestioned. Nora found herself observing him, fascinated despite her fear. He was demanding, his expectations clear but never cruel. He simply expected to be obeyed, and everyone around him did so without question. She found herself subtly seeking his gaze, an instinct to yield to his authority, taking root even as she fought against it. One afternoon, he found her in the library, a vast room lined with leather-bound books. He held her old medical ID badge in his hand, the plastic cracked down the middle, her tired photo staring back at her. Her name, Nora Thorne, registered nurse, seemed a relic from a different lifetime. "This will no longer be necessary," he said, his voice quiet, almost gentle, yet carrying the weight of absolute finality. He held it out, then simply snapped it in half, the sound sharp in the quiet room. Nora gasped, a pang of loss hitting her. It was a tangible severing, the last thread connecting her to the person she used to be. Tears pricked at her eyes, but she swallowed them back. She looked at the two broken halves, then up at his face. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes held a possessive intensity. He had taken her badge, her profession, her past, but he had done it to protect her, and in that moment she understood. Her old life had offered her little protection, only constant worry. This new life, however terrifyingly absolute, offered a fortress. She watched him for a long moment, then nodded, a silent surrender. The gesture felt heavy, momentous, yet also profoundly liberating. He had stripped her of her old identity, but he had also gifted her an impenetrable shield. It was a golden cage, yes, but for the first time in her life, Nora felt undeniably, absolutely safe. Her every need was met, her every fear anticipated, every potential threat held at bay by the formidable power of the man who had claimed her. She was his, and in his demanding, overwhelming presence, she was finally, strangely, at peace. Nora found herself falling into a strange rhythm, a new reality that, while still daunting, no longer sparked the raw terror of her first awakening. Her days were now a blend of opulent solitude and the undeniable constant presence of Gabriel's authority. She observed him from a distance, watching him command his men, his voice deep and calm, his orders never questioned. There was a chilling efficiency to his movements, a silent power that resonated through the mansion, making every decision seem absolute, every rule non-negotiable. She had begun to yield. It wasn't a conscious choice born of fear alone, but a subtle, almost instinctual leaning into his guidance. Her weariness, the constant burden of making her own way, had left her craving a protector, and Gabriel, for all his terrifying power, was that protector. His unwavering command, the unshakable certainty with which he moved through his dangerous world, began to foster a burgeoning trust in his protective instinct. She might be a bird in a gilded cage, but the cage was impenetrable, and the man who held the key was fiercely devoted to keeping her safe. The velvet collar necklace, once a symbol of her forced claim, had transformed. It was a constant, tangible presence at her throat, a soft weight that she had grown accustomed to. When she touched it, she no longer felt solely the chill of ownership, but a strange warmth, a quiet hum of belonging. It was a reminder that she was his, and therefore untouchable by anyone else. It was her shield, a visible sign to his world that she was under his absolute protection. Gabriel, for his part, was not a man of gentle words or overt affection. His kindnesses were unspoken, woven into the fabric of her new life in ways she slowly began to recognize. One afternoon, she had idly mentioned a forgotten author from her college days, a niche historian whose works were hard to find. The next day, a pristine, leather-bound collection of his books appeared on her bedside table, a silent gift. Another time, she'd felt a sudden, wistful craving for a specific, obscure dessert from a tiny bakery in the French Quarter she'd loved. It appeared at dinner, perfectly prepared, without a word spoken about it. These small gestures, devoid of softness yet undeniably caring, were like tiny anchors, deepening her connection to him. He was demanding, yes, and his control was absolute, but he saw her, he heard her, and he provided. Yet, beyond the thick walls of the mansion, the world remained a dangerous place. She would often catch snippets of hushed conversations among Gabriel's men, their voices low and urgent, discussing moves and threats and the package. She didn't understand the details, nor did she want to, but the implication was clear. The trafficking ring, the one that had ambushed Gabriel and now knew her face, was still out there, a phantom menace. Sometimes, late at night, the rain would lash against the wrought-iron balconies of the mansion with renewed fury, a violent symphony that echoed the storm brewing outside. Nora would stand by the window, peering through the rain-streaked glass at the blurry lights of the city across the river. The world beyond the mansion's gates felt chaotic and menacing, filled with unseen dangers. But within these walls, under Gabriel's watchful eye, she was safe. The roar of the storm, the whispers of threats, the very real external danger were all held at bay by the formidable, unyielding power of the man who had claimed her as his own. She might have been taken, but she was also protected, and in that unsettling truth, Nora found a profound, if terrifying, sense of peace. Nora found herself falling deeper into the rhythm of the mansion, a strange current pulling her along. The initial shock had softened, replaced by a complex tapestry of awe, trepidation, and a burgeoning, unexpected sense of peace. She still saw the Mafia king, a man whose very presence commanded silent, absolute obedience from everyone around him. But now she saw something more. She saw the man who had deliberately tested for kindness, the man who, beneath the formidable exterior, had chosen her for that very trait. Her trust in his judgment, initially a fragile thing born of necessity, began to solidify. She watched him interact with his men, observed his swift, decisive actions when a security detail was tightened or a message relayed. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty. He moved with the confidence of a predator, yet every action, every command seemed to orbit around her safety. His possessiveness, once a terrifying chain, now felt like an impenetrable shield. It wasn't just that he had taken her, it was that he would never let anyone else touch her. That thought, chilling as it was, brought with it a profound, almost dizzying sense of relief. For the first time in her life, she didn't have to fight, didn't have to watch her own back. Gabriel did it all. She found herself instinctively looking to him for direction, not just out of fear, but from a growing desire to please him, to fit seamlessly into the world he had created for her. If she considered reading in the library or taking a walk in the enclosed garden, her first thought was to seek his silent approval. He wouldn't always speak, sometimes just a glance, a slight tilt of his head was enough to communicate his permission or his expectation. He subtly reinforced her dependence, a gentle yet firm hand guiding her every step. He would ask about her preferences for meals, for books, for the temperature of the room, but always with an underlying expectation that her answers would align with his overarching plan for her comfort and safety. It was always clear that she was his, and her role was to thrive within that protection. She recognized that her place wasn't to fight him, to push against his absolute authority, but to find safety and a new purpose within the vast strength he offered. This new way of being, this relinquishment of control, was a revelation. For so long, Nora had carried the weight of her own life, the constant anxiety of making ends meet, the gnawing fear of her stalker ex, the relentless demands of her charity work. She had always been the one taking care of others, never truly taken care of herself. Now she was cherished, protected, and provided for. It was terrifying, yes, to give up so much of herself, but it was also liberating. An unexpected inner strength began to bloom within her, not the strength of defiance, but the quiet, deep resilience of acceptance. She wasn't weak for yielding. She was strong for recognizing what her weary soul had craved for so long. She found peace in the stillness, in the quiet certainty of Gabriel's unwavering presence. Her days were no longer spent battling the world, but existing within a world meticulously crafted for her. The velvet collar necklace, always at her throat, was no longer a symbol of abduction, but a tangible reminder of her unique, protected status. She was his queen, safe within his domain, and in that powerful, possessive embrace, Nora Thorne, the tired nurse, finally found a profound, undeniable sense of belonging and, against all odds, a deep, quiet peace. Nora had, against all reason, begun to find a rhythm within the opulent walls of Gabriel's mansion. Her days, once a blur of frantic activity and low-level anxiety, now flowed with a strange, unhurried grace. She read, she explored the vast, quiet rooms, always aware of the watchful, silent men who guarded her every step. It was a gilded cage, but the gold was undeniably comforting, and the bars were forged from Gabriel's formidable will. This fragile peace shattered one evening when Gabriel found her in the conservatory, a glass room filled with lush, exotic plants. He stood framed in the doorway, his silhouette imposing against the fading light, his presence instantly commanding the space. He didn't sit, didn't relax. His eyes, dark and piercing, held a gravity that Nora immediately recognized as a prelude to something important, something dangerous. "We need to speak, Nora," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble that vibrated through the quiet room. "About the outside." She instinctively straightened, her hands clasping in her lap. She knew intellectually that a threat still lingered, but Gabriel's absolute control had made it easy to almost forget. Now the reality was stark. He began to speak, detailing the trafficking ring with a cold, precise language that painted a terrifying picture. They were ruthless, he explained, their network vast and insidious. Their primary motive for wanting her was simple. She had been with him during the ambush. They likely believed she had information, or perhaps more chillingly, they simply wanted her because she was connected to him, a pawn in their dangerous game. His words were devoid of emotion, yet the underlying current of danger was palpable, making Nora's skin prickle with dread. She was a target, not because of anything she had done, but because she had shown kindness to a man who was, in fact, a king of shadows. As he spoke, Nora felt a familiar wave of vulnerability, a cold dread that tightened her chest. But then, Gabriel took a step closer, his gaze unwavering, and an undeniable sense of safety washed over her. He wasn't just informing her, he was preparing her, and in his unwavering focus, she found a strange anchor. He wouldn't let them touch her. The next few days brought a tangible shift in the mansion's atmosphere. Nora noticed it first in small ways. The silent men seemed even more numerous, their movements more deliberate. Doors that had once been left slightly ajar were now always firmly closed. Gabriel's phone calls, which she sometimes overheard from a distance, grew sharper, more urgent. His jaw would clench, his eyes hardening with a cold, lethal resolve she was coming to understand. Then he confirmed her unspoken fears. There had been an incident. A surveillance drone, sophisticated and silent, had been spotted on the perimeter. An attempted breach, swiftly neutralized, but an attempt nonetheless. The outside world was pressing in, a relentless, dangerous force. "They are testing the defenses," Gabriel stated, his voice a low growl that held a chilling promise of retribution. He stood by the window, his back to her, looking out at the rain-lashed wrought-iron balconies. "But they will not succeed." Nora felt a shiver of pure terror. The idea of shadowy figures trying to infiltrate her sanctuary, the place Gabriel had created for her, was horrifying. But then she watched Gabriel, his broad shoulders squared, his posture radiating an unshakable strength. He was her impenetrable fortress, and his vigilance was absolute. Her fear was real, but so was her trust in him, a solid, unyielding thing. She found herself moving closer, seeking the silent comfort of his presence. He turned then, his eyes locking onto hers, and in their depths, she saw not just protection but a cold, simmering fury. "There is something else," he said, his voice dropping, each word weighted with a chilling finality. "Something you need to know about how they found you." Nora's breath hitched, her heart began to pound, a frantic drum against her ribs. "Your former clinic director," Gabriel revealed, his voice laced with venom, "was selling patient files, all of them, including yours." The words hit Nora like a physical blow. Her mind reeled, struggling to grasp the enormity of the betrayal. Her clinic director? The woman she had worked alongside, the woman who had always seemed so dedicated to their mission of charity. Selling patient files, it was unthinkable, monstrous. A wave of nausea washed over her, a deep, personal wound far more painful than any external threat. The trust she had placed in her old life, in the people she had worked with, shattered into a million pieces. Gabriel watched her, his expression grim. "This betrayal," he continued, his voice now a low, dangerous rumble, "explains everything. How they knew your name, your history, how they tracked you even after I brought you here. It was a direct affront, Nora, not just to your safety, but to my initial test, to my purpose." His words, though still cold, held a fierce, possessive anger that wasn't directed at her, but for her. His fury was a tangible force in the room, a promise of swift, brutal vengeance against the woman who had dared to betray Nora, and, by extension, him. Nora, still reeling from the shock of betrayal, found herself clinging to that fury. It was terrifying, yes, but it was also a magnificent protective shield. Gabriel's cold rage was her ultimate safety, and in that moment she knew, with an absolute certainty, that no one who dared to harm her or betray her trust would ever escape his wrath. The betrayal of her clinic director still smarted, a festering wound beneath Nora's fragile peace. She wandered through the vast, quiet rooms, the luxurious carpets muffling her footsteps, her mind replaying Gabriel's cold pronouncement. How could someone she had trusted, someone dedicated to helping others, have been so utterly corrupt? The world she had known, the one she had poured her heart into, felt like a cruel illusion. Gabriel's fortress was her only reality now, the only place where truth, however terrifying, held a promise of safety. She was in the grand drawing room, gazing out at the rain-swept gardens, when one of Gabriel's men approached her. Unlike the others, who were usually silent and watchful, this man looked uneasy. He held a small, crumpled note, folded many times over between his thumb and forefinger, as if it was something vile. "Ma'am," he said, his voice unusually strained, "this was found outside the gates, tucked into a rose bush." Nora took the note, her fingers trembling slightly. The paper was cheap, the handwriting familiar, a scrawl she recognized with a sickening lurch in her stomach. A familiar terror, cold and sharp, clawed its way up her throat. It was his handwriting, her stalker X. Her eyes scanned the words, a sickening blend of possessiveness and delusion. "Nora, my love, I know you're in there. Don't think he can keep you. You belong to me. Always have, always will. I'm coming for you." The world tilted. The opulent room, the watchful guard, Gabriel's unwavering protection, all of it seemed to dissolve under the weight of this familiar personal nightmare. The trafficking ring was an abstract, baseless threat. Her ex was real, a monster from her past who knew her vulnerabilities, who had haunted her every step for years. This was worse. This was her terror, reaching across the impenetrable walls of Gabriel's domain. She felt utterly exposed, utterly vulnerable, a scream catching in her throat. Gabriel entered the room at that moment, drawn by the unusual tension. His eyes, sharp and assessing, landed on Nora's pale face, then on the crumpled note in her trembling hand. He moved with a swiftness that belied his casual posture, taking the note from her without a word. His gaze swept over the familiar scrawl, and Nora watched as his face, usually a mask of controlled power, tightened with an almost imperceptible shift. "Who delivered this?" he asked, his voice low, deceptively calm, but with an underlying current that made the air crackle. The guard flinched, explaining how it was found. Gabriel simply nodded, his eyes now cold, like chips of obsidian. He didn't need to ask Nora who it was. The fury in his eyes was chilling, a silent promise of swift, brutal retribution. This wasn't just a nuisance. This was a direct, unforgivable challenge. Not to her safety alone, but to his absolute control. His claim, the touch her and die ethos he lived by, was etched into every rigid line of his powerful frame. This man, her ex, had dared to touch what was his. Nora felt a profound, primal fear, the kind that made her want to curl into a ball and disappear. But then, Gabriel turned, his dark eyes locking onto hers, and in their depths, she saw not just rage, but a chilling, absolute certainty. He wouldn't let this stand. He wouldn't let anyone harm her, especially not this pathetic shadow from her past. She instinctively sought him, moving without conscious thought, her legs carrying her towards him. She pressed herself against his broad back, her hands clutching at the fine fabric of his suit jacket, seeking the solid anchor of his strength. The velvet collar necklace felt like a lifeline around her throat, a tangible reminder of his possessive protection. He was a force of nature, a terrifying, beautiful storm, and she was willingly caught in its eye. Gabriel's large hand came up, covering hers where it gripped his jacket, a silent acknowledgement of her fear, her reliance. His touch was firm, possessive, a silent reassurance that he had her. He didn't turn, didn't offer soft words, but the sheer power radiating from him was a comfort far deeper than any platitude. He was her shield, her fortress, and he would eradicate this threat as he would any other. Her trust in his ability to make this nightmare disappear was absolute, unshakable. She was his, and no one, not even the ghost of her past, would be allowed to challenge that. The unsettling reality of her stalker ex, combined with the clinic director's monstrous betrayal, had left Nora feeling raw and exposed, even within the mansion's fortified walls. The familiar terror of her past had breached the present, yet Gabriel's immediate, lethal response had also solidified her trust in him. He was a ruthless protector, and that was exactly what she needed. The calm that followed was brief, a deceptive lull before a storm. Gabriel's network, already vast, seemed to stretch even further, a silent web tightening around the city. The mansion, her golden cage, began to transform, each change a stark reminder of the escalating war outside. One morning, Gabriel summoned her to his study, a room usually reserved for hushed calls and grim pronouncements. He stood behind his enormous dark wood desk, a formidable silhouette against the rain-streaked window. "They have made a direct demand," he stated, his voice devoid of inflection, yet carrying a chilling weight that made Nora's stomach clench. "The trafficking ring. They want you, Nora. They believe you are a weakness, a bargaining chip." He paused, his eyes, dark as midnight, locking onto hers. "They have threatened violence, widespread disruption if you are not surrendered." Nora felt a cold dread seep into her bones. Her breath hitched, her throat tightening. To be wanted by such monsters, to be the focus of their malice, was terrifying. But then she looked at Gabriel. His jaw was set, his broad shoulders squared. There was no fear in him, only a cold, unyielding resolve. He was preparing for war, an all-out war, and she was the reason. The sheer scale of his power, now fully unleashed for her sake, was both terrifying and profoundly reassuring. He began to move, striding from behind his desk, his presence filling the room, pushing back the shadows. "This mansion," he explained, his voice low, a deep rumble that vibrated through her, "is already secure, but it will become impenetrable." And it did. Nora watched, fascinated and unnerved, as the mansion was transformed into a fortress. More men appeared, silent sentinels stationed at every corridor, every entrance. New, unfamiliar technology hummed softly behind reinforced walls. Steel plates were discreetly installed behind the intricate wrought-iron gates, visible only to the sharpest eye. Gabriel himself oversaw much of it, his large hands gesturing, his gaze missing nothing, his commands crisp and absolute. She would see him in the dimly lit hallways, checking a lock, speaking in low tones with his lieutenants. Every action a direct measure for her protection. Her own movements, already restricted, became even more so. The enclosed garden, once a small solace, was now deemed too exposed. She was permitted only in specific, central rooms, always within sight of a guard, always within the mansion's deepest core. There was no question, no argument. Gabriel's word was law, his decisions final. Logically, Nora knew she should feel suffocated, resentful of this absolute confinement. But instead, a strange, deep calm settled over her. Each new fortification, each additional guard, each restriction was a tangible expression of Gabriel's unyielding will to protect her. She was a precious, vital cargo, and he was the captain of an unbreakable ship. Her fear of the outside world, of the monsters who wanted her, began to recede, replaced by an even deeper trust in him. She found herself, almost unconsciously, becoming his steadfast anchor. When he would return from intense, often silent meetings, his face etched with the weight of command, she would simply be there. She didn't need to speak, didn't need to ask questions. She would sit quietly in the library, perhaps, reading a book. Her velvet collar necklace, a soft weight at her throat, a visible sign of her belonging. He would often just stand in the doorway for a moment, his gaze sweeping over her, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. In these moments, she understood her role. She was not a warrior, not a strategist in his dangerous world. She was his calm, yielding presence amidst the storm he was preparing to unleash. Her unwavering trust, her quiet acceptance of his absolute authority was her strength, her contribution to their fight. She was his queen, protected and cherished. And in the heart of his impenetrable fortress, Nora Thorne found a profound, unwavering peace, ready for whatever battle he would face for her sake. The ominous calm of the mansion had been a temporary reprieve, a fragile shield against the escalating threats outside. Now, Gabriel's presence in the grand drawing room, where Nora often sought solace, felt different. He hadn't called for her, hadn't summoned her. He had simply appeared, standing by the vast fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back, his posture radiating a quiet power that drew every ounce of her attention. The air thickened with unspoken gravity. "Come, Nora," he said, his voice a low, steady current that flowed through the room, compelling her to move. It wasn't a request, it was an invitation she couldn't refuse, a command veiled in gentleness. She rose from the plush armchair, her velvet collar necklace a familiar weight at her throat, and walked towards him, her gaze fixed on his imposing figure. He waited until she was close, then gestured to the sofa opposite him. "Sit." She obeyed instantly, sinking into the soft cushions, her eyes never leaving his. He remained standing, his height towering over her, emphasizing the immense power he held. "There are things you need to understand," he began, his voice deeper now, almost solemn. "Things about the past, about why I was in that alley that night, and why you are here now." Nora's heart began to thrum, a nervous flutter against her ribs. She had always known there was more to their story, more to his hidden identity than met the eye. Now he was going to reveal it. "Years ago," he continued, his eyes fixed on the flickering flames in the grate, his profile sharp and unyielding, "I began investigating this trafficking ring. Their operations touched many parts of this city, and they were particularly ruthless." He paused, then turned his gaze to her, and the intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. "You, Nora, unknowingly became a small part of that investigation. An innocent bystander, connected through an early lead, a name that surfaced in a periphery report." Nora felt a chill spread through her. She had been a part of his world, a shadow in his dangerous game, long before she even knew he existed. It was a dizzying thought, terrifying in its implication. "There was a raid," he went on, his voice low, almost a confession. "A messy affair. Your name, your connection, however tangential, put you at risk of being pulled into the police reports, of being exposed to their network. I couldn't allow that." He took a slow step towards her, his presence utterly consuming. "During that raid, I took a bullet." His words were calm, matter-of-fact, as if discussing the weather. Nora gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. A bullet? For her. He had been hurt years ago to protect her, a woman he didn't even know. "It was necessary," he said, seeing her shock, "to ensure your name stayed off those files, to keep you safe, unseen, unknowing." His eyes, dark and ancient, bore into hers. "I was already watching you, Nora. Even then, your kindness, your unwavering compassion at the clinic. It captivated me. I knew then that I would eventually claim you. That night in the alley, disguised as a beggar, was my final test. To see if the woman I intended to own still possessed that same soft heart." The revelation hit Nora with the force of a physical blow. The beggar wasn't the beginning. It was the culmination. He had been a silent guardian, a shadow protector, watching her, choosing her, for years. Her life, once so mundane and solitary, had been intricately woven into his dangerous tapestry, a destiny orchestrated by a powerful man who saw her and decided she was his. The thought was overwhelming, terrifying, yet a profound, undeniable warmth spread through her chest. Tears welled in Nora's eyes, not from fear, but from a deep, aching understanding. This wasn't an abduction. It was a long-deferred claim. This wasn't just protection, it was a relentless, possessive obsession that had spanned years, culminating in his bullet, his silent vigil, his final test. It was a love, dark and absolute, that had always been there, waiting for her. She looked up at him, her vision blurred by tears, seeing not just the MAFIA king, but the man who had sacrificed for her, watched over her, who had always intended to make her his. His power, his command, his ruthlessness, none of it diminished, but now infused with a profound, terrifying devotion that mirrored her own burgeoning feelings. "Gabriel," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, the name a silent surrender. The choice she had felt forced into, the marriage she had accepted out of terror and a strange relief, now felt like a profound, beautiful truth. She reached out, her hand trembling slightly as she placed it on his arm. This wasn't just his claim. It was her choice, made real by his long-hidden devotion. She wanted to be his wife, for real. The revelation of Gabriel's hidden devotion, the years he'd watched over her, the bullet he'd taken for her sake, had solidified Nora's world. The tears had dried, leaving behind a quiet resolve. Her fear of him hadn't vanished entirely, but it had morphed into something akin to awe, a profound respect for the depth of his possessive love. The marriage, once a terrifying claim, was now a shared truth, a destiny she willingly embraced. But her new reality, however comforting in its protective embrace, was still steeped in shadows. The traitorous clinic director, the woman who had sold Nora's trust for profit, remained a festering wound in Nora's heart. Gabriel, however, saw it as an unforgivable affront, a direct challenge to his authority and to the woman he had chosen. The mansion vibrated with a new, chilling energy. Gabriel unleashed his full network, a terrifying, unseen force that spread through the city like a silent tide. Nora would often see him in his study, a stark, powerful figure silhouetted against the dark wood, his voice a low, steady current flowing through phone calls. He spoke in clipped, precise sentences, his commands absolute. She understood, without needing to hear the details, that he was hunting, and his prey was the woman who had betrayed her. Nora felt a profound unease, a shiver running down her spine at the thought of the violence he was orchestrating. Her gentle nature recoiled from the ruthlessness, the cold efficiency of his retribution. Yet when she looked at Gabriel, saw the hard set of his jaw, the unyielding focus in his dark eyes, she understood. This wasn't just revenge. It was a necessary cleansing, a violent pruning of the dangers that had dared to threaten her. This ruthlessness, this chilling determination, was a part of the protection he offered, an undeniable aspect of the future he was building for them. She often found herself drawn to him in these moments, a quiet, emotional anchor in the storm he was brewing. She wouldn't speak, wouldn't interrupt his calls, but would simply be present. Sometimes she would place a light hand on his arm as he walked past, a silent offering of support. He would pause, his gaze sweeping over her, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, before his hand would come up, covering hers, a warm, possessive weight. It was his silent acknowledgement, a shared understanding that this fight, however brutal, was for her, for their future. She might be horrified by the violence, but she was unwavering in her support of him. The velvet collar necklace, a constant presence at her throat, felt heavier in these days, a tangible reminder of her belonging, her protected status, and the lengths Gabriel would go to defend it. As Gabriel's grip on the city's underworld tightened, the whispers of the trafficking ring grew more frantic, more desperate. Nora would catch snippets of conversations among his men, a hurried mention of assets compromised, routes blocked, the boss is squeezing them. The rain-lashed wrought-iron balconies of the mansion seemed to hum with the growing tension, the outside world pushing back against Gabriel's relentless advance. One evening, the atmosphere in the mansion crackled with a new urgency. Gabriel's lieutenants moved with a heightened sense of purpose, their faces grim. She heard Gabriel's voice, sharper than usual, echoing from his study. Later he emerged, his expression colder, more dangerous than she had ever seen it. He found Nora in the library, her hands unconsciously smoothing the soft velvet at her throat. His eyes, dark as a winter storm, met hers. "They made a move," he stated, his voice a low growl, "a desperate one. They targeted one of my key men, a crucial asset." Nora gasped, her heart leaping into her throat. An attack. Not just against Gabriel's network, but against his people. The faceless threat was becoming bolder, more direct. A cold wave of fear washed over her, not just for herself, but for Gabriel, for his men, for the fragile peace he had created for her. Gabriel saw her fear, and his jaw clenched. He didn't offer reassurance in words, but in the sheer formidable presence he exuded. He was coiled, ready to strike, radiating a lethal intent that promised absolute annihilation for anyone who dared to challenge him. The trafficking ring was cornered, desperate, and their desperation would be their undoing. Nora knew with a chilling certainty that this was the final push, the beginning of the end. And Gabriel, her dark king, would stop at nothing to secure their world. The mansion was an echo chamber of impending violence, the air thick with Gabriel's cold resolve. Nora felt it in the hushed urgency of his men, in the way the rain lashed against the windows like angry fists. The trafficking ring was a monstrous entity, but the thought of her ex, that personal, insidious terror, still made her skin crawl. Gabriel's promise of vengeance, however chilling, was a comfort she clutched like a lifeline. She was in the Grand Library, trying to lose herself in a book, when it happened. A sudden, jarring crash from a distant part of the mansion ripped through the silence, followed by the blare of an alarm, shrill and insistent. Her heart leapt into her throat, a choked gasp escaping her lips. This wasn't the distant threat. This was an immediate, visceral violation. Someone had breached. Nora knew exactly who. Panic, cold and suffocating, seized her. She scrambled to her feet, her hands flying to her throat, clutching the velvet collar necklace as if it could somehow shield her from the terror now unleashed within these walls. Footsteps pounded in the hallway, shouts echoing. She instinctively backed away, pressing herself against a towering bookshelf, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Then Gabriel was there. He appeared in the library doorway, a dark, imposing silhouette against the chaos outside. His eyes, cold and lethal, swept the room, landing on Nora's terrified face. His gaze was a command, a silent anchor in the storm. He didn't speak, but moved with a terrifying grace, striding directly towards the source of the commotion. Nora, paralyzed by a mixture of fear and a strange, desperate hope, could only watch. She heard a guttural yell, a sound of frustrated rage, followed by the unmistakable thud of a body hitting the floor. Gabriel reappeared in the doorway, and this time he wasn't alone. He held a man by the back of his neck, effortlessly dragging him into the room. It was her ex. His face was a mask of desperate fury, hair disheveled, clothes torn, his eyes wild with an unhinged obsession that made Nora's blood run cold. He thrashed, trying to break free, but in Gabriel's grip he was utterly helpless, a pathetic, struggling animal. "Nora!" her ex shrieked, his voice raw and desperate. "You belong to me. He can't keep you." The sound of his voice, the sight of his face sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated terror through Nora. Her past, her personal nightmare, had finally caught up to her. Every insecurity, every fear she'd ever harbored because of him, flared to life. She squeezed her eyes shut, unable to bear the sight, wanting only for him to disappear, to cease to exist. But then she felt Gabriel's presence, a wall of strength and calm authority that dwarfed even her profound terror. He hadn't flinched, hadn't reacted to the pathetic cries. He simply held the struggling man, his grip absolute, his power undeniable. "Silence," Gabriel commanded, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that cut through the ex's frantic struggles like a surgeon's scalpel. It wasn't a shout, but a whisper of absolute authority, and the ex instantly went limp, a whimper escaping his lips. He was broken, utterly subdued. Gabriel then turned, his dark eyes locking onto Nora's. She was still trembling, but the primal fear began to recede, replaced by a profound, dizzying relief. He had come for her. He had stopped him. He would always stop him. Without a word, she instinctively took a step, then another, until she was behind Gabriel, pressing herself against his broad back, seeking the solid anchor of his powerful frame. Her hands clutched at his suit jacket, her fingers digging into the fabric. The velvet collar necklace felt safe, heavy, a protective weight at her throat. Gabriel's large hand came up, covering hers where it rested on his jacket. A silent reassurance, a possessive claim. He didn't turn, didn't offer soft words, but the sheer, unwavering power radiating from him was a comfort far deeper than any platitude. His gaze, still fixed on her ex, was a chilling promise. "Secure him!" Gabriel ordered his men, his voice utterly devoid of emotion, yet carrying the weight of a death sentence. He will await the final reckoning. As his men moved in, the ex's eyes, wide with sudden, dawning terror, locked onto Nora's. He finally understood. He hadn't just threatened her, he had challenged Gabriel, and that was a mistake no one survived. Nora, sheltered by Gabriel's formidable presence, felt a profound, chilling peace. Her personal nightmare was over, extinguished by the absolute, ruthless will of the man who had claimed her. Gabriel's protection was absolute, his resolve solidified. Anyone who dared to touch what was his would pay the ultimate price. This was a prelude, a chilling promise of the terror Gabriel intended to unleash, not just on the trafficking ring, but on any shadow that dared to linger near his queen. The mansion itself seemed to hold its breath, a vast, opulent structure now thrumming with a contained, dangerous energy. The air was thick with it, a palpable tension that settled deep in Nora's bones. The capture of her ex, a terrifying personal victory orchestrated by Gabriel, had only sharpened the focus on the true enemy, the trafficking ring. Gabriel's wrath, once simmering, was now a cold, controlled fire, ready to consume all who dared threaten what was his. One evening, Gabriel summoned her to his study. The room was dark, lit only by the amber glow of a single lamp on his massive desk, casting long shadows across his formidable frame. He stood before a large map of New Orleans, intricate lines and markings covering its surface, his back to her. His presence filled the space, a silent, powerful demand for her attention. "Come, Nora," he said, his voice a low, steady current that vibrated through the quiet room. It held no softness, no question, only absolute command. She walked towards him, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet, her heart beating a nervous rhythm against her ribs. He waited until she was beside him, then gestured to the map with a long, powerful finger. "The time for waiting is over," he stated, his voice a low growl that settled deep in her chest. "I have finalized the plans, every detail, every movement." Nora looked at the map, seeing not just streets and buildings, but a tapestry of calculated violence, a meticulously orchestrated strike. Her breath hitched. He was going to war, and she was the silent queen for whom the battle would be fought. He explained in terse, precise language, the targets, the movements, the timing. He spoke of eliminating threats, of cutting off escape routes, of ensuring absolute eradication. His voice, deep and resonant, held no trace of doubt, no hesitation. He treated her not as a pawn, but as an essential part of his world, a queen to be informed, even if she had no say in his violent methods. He wanted her to understand the lengths he would go to protect her. Her fear was real, a cold knot in her stomach, but his resolve was a greater force. She listened, absorbing his chilling plans, and a profound, dizzying sense of safety washed over her. He would leave no stone unturned, no enemy standing. This was his promise, delivered with the stark truth of a man who wielded absolute power. He turned from the map, his dark eyes sweeping over her, intense and possessive. "This will be absolute," he said, his hand reaching out, his large fingers brushing the velvet collar necklace at her throat. The touch was a silent reminder, a tangible connection. "No one will ever threaten you again, Nora. Not the ring. Not your pathetic ex. No one." She felt herself leaning into his touch, her hand instinctively coming up to cover his, a quiet gesture of support. She didn't need to speak. Her place was firmly by his side, her presence a calming anchor in the storm he was preparing to unleash. She was his queen, and her strength was in her unwavering trust, her quiet acceptance of his authority, her profound devotion. She was his anchor, his quiet harbor, and she offered him her silent comfort as he prepared for battle. The atmosphere within the mansion grew heavy, a palpable weight that mirrored the coming storm outside. News reports, discreetly brought to Gabriel, hinted at unexplained disappearances in the city's underworld, a heightened sense of unrest in the shadowy French Quarter streets. It was Gabriel's network, tightening its grip, preparing the ground for his final, decisive move. Outside, the rain lashed the wrought-iron balconies with increasing intensity, a furious drumbeat against the Gothic architecture. It was a violent symphony, a fitting prelude to the reckoning. Nora stood by the window, watching the rain-streaked glass, her hand resting on the velvet collar at her throat. The world beyond the mansion's walls was a dangerous, chaotic place, but within these walls, with Gabriel by her side, she felt an unshakable peace. His protection was her world, and she belonged utterly to him, ready for the storm he would face for her sake. The air outside the mansion was thick and heavy, charged with the electric promise of violence. The rain, which had been a constant companion for days, now fell in solid sheets, blurring the world beyond the wrought-iron gates. Nora sat in the back of Gabriel's armored car, the plush leather a stark contrast to the primal fear thrumming beneath her skin. Gabriel sat beside her, silent and formidable, his presence a dark, unyielding anchor in the swirling chaos. He had told her she would be with him, that she would witness the reckoning. It wasn't a choice, but a command, and a part of her, the part that utterly trusted his protection, found a strange solace in it. The vehicle moved through the flooded streets of New Orleans, the tires hissing through standing water. Buildings passed in a blur, until finally the car pulled to a stop in a narrow, rain-lashed alley. Nora recognized it instantly, a cold shock seizing her heart. It was the alley behind the charity clinic, the very place where her old life had ended, and her new, terrifying one had begun. The symbolism was stark, brutal. This was where it would all be judged. Gabriel's door opened, and his men, dark, silent figures, moved with practiced efficiency, forming a protective perimeter. He turned to Nora, his eyes, dark as the storm-filled sky, meeting hers. "Stay close, Nora," he commanded, his voice a low rumble that cut through the roar of the rain, demanding absolute obedience. "Behind me, always." She nodded, unable to speak, her throat tight with a mixture of terror and fierce devotion. She knew her place, understood her role. She was his queen, and he was her shield. Stepping out into the deluge, the cold water immediately soaked her shoes, but she barely registered it. The alley was a swirling vortex of rain and shadows, dimly lit by the flickering streetlights at either end. Figures emerged from the gloom, men in dark, rain-slicked clothes, their faces grim, their weapons glinting. The trafficking ring. And then, at the center of them, she saw him, her ex, gagged and bound, his eyes wide with a terror that was now truly justified. He looked small, pathetic, utterly broken. Beside him, the clinic director, her face pale and contorted, stared at Nora with a mixture of fear and hatred. All the threats, all the betrayals, gathered in one place. Gabriel moved, a terrifying force of nature. He took a single step forward, pulling Nora with him, his arm a solid, unyielding band around her waist, pressing her firmly behind him. His body was a living shield, impenetrable and absolute. His head was held high, his face a mask of cold fury, his eyes blazing with a lethal intent that promised annihilation. He was a king unleashing his wrath, and Nora, sheltered against his back, felt the sheer, terrifying power radiating from him. "You dared," Gabriel's voice boomed, cutting through the storm, each word a hammer blow, "to touch what is mine. The air crackled. The traffickers, despite their numbers, hesitated, a flicker of fear in their eyes as they faced the formidable figure of the Mafia king. Gabriel didn't wait. He moved, not with wild abandon, but with brutal, precise efficiency. His hand, so recently a gentle, possessive presence at her throat, now held a silenced weapon, its dark gleam almost invisible in the rain. A shot rang out, sharp and decisive, instantly felling one of the traffickers. Another followed, and another. Gabriel fired with an almost terrifying calm, each shot finding its mark, each movement fluid and lethal. He held Nora securely behind him with one arm, his body a living wall, his other arm moving with deadly grace, extinguishing threats as easily as one might swat a fly. His commands to his men were low, terse, lethal. Nora, pressed against his broad back, felt the vibrations of each shot against her chest. Her heart hammered, her breath caught in her throat. She saw flashes of violence, heard the guttural cries of men falling, the splash of bodies in the flooded alley. It was terrifying, horrific, a scene from her darkest nightmares. Yet, shielded by Gabriel, held so utterly secure against his formidable strength, she felt an undeniable, profound sense of safety. He was fighting for her, eliminating every last shadow that had ever dared to threaten her peace. In the midst of the chaos, her gaze fell to the ground and she saw it. Her old medical ID badge broken in half submerged in a puddle. The picture, faded and weary, stared up at her. It was a final, violent severing. Her old life, the one filled with fear and exhaustion, was irrevocably gone, washed away by the storm, extinguished by the man who held her. Gabriel's arm tightened around her, a silent reassurance as the last of the traffickers fell. The sounds of the fight faded, replaced by the relentless drumbeat of the rain. The alley was silent, save for the splashing water and the heavy breathing of Gabriel's men. All threats were gone, all dangers eradicated. And Nora, held securely within the unyielding embrace of her king, felt a profound, absolute peace settle over her, a quiet understanding that she was finally, irrevocably safe. The alley was silent now, save for the relentless downpour and the quiet, efficient movements of Gabriel's men securing the area. Nora, still pressed against Gabriel's back, felt the shuddering aftermath of the violence, her body trembling with a mixture of horror and an undeniable, profound relief. The storm raged, but within Gabriel's unyielding embrace, she felt an absolute calm. He was her fortress, and he had just raised the world of her enemies. Gabriel shifted, his arm still a firm band around her waist, but his attention now turned fully. Nora felt him move, his powerful body a shield as he pivoted. Her eyes, wide and still tear-streaked from the rain, followed his gaze. There, still bound and helpless in the driving rain, were her ex-boyfriend and the clinic director. Her heart clenched, a fresh wave of fear mingling with the deep, festering hurt of their betrayals. They were the last shadows, the final remnants of the terror that had haunted her. Gabriel took a slow, deliberate step towards her ex. His face was a mask of cold fury, his eyes devoid of mercy. Nora instinctively tightened her grip on his jacket, a silent plea and a silent acceptance. She didn't want to see, yet she couldn't look away. This man, who had stolen her peace for so long, who had dared to threaten what was his, was about to face the ultimate reckoning. Gabriel's hand, so firm and powerful, moved with chilling swiftness. A sharp, decisive sound, swallowed almost instantly by the rain, and her ex slumped, a final guttural gasp lost to the storm. He was gone. The burden, the constant, low thrum of anxiety that had defined so much of Nora's life, lifted, leaving behind a hollow, dizzying emptiness that was rapidly filling with an overwhelming sense of liberation. Gabriel turned, his gaze sweeping over the clinic director, who whimpered, her face a pale, terrified mask. The woman who had sold her patients, who had betrayed Nora's trust with such casual cruelty, now faced the unyielding justice of the MAFIA king. Nora felt a pang of something akin to sorrow for the woman's fear, but it was quickly overshadowed by the memory of the profound betrayal, the shattered trust. This wasn't just about Gabriel's power. It was about the protection of her soft heart, a heart that had been wounded by this woman's greed. Another swift, brutal motion, another sound lost to the storm, and she too was gone. All threats, personal and systemic, ruthlessly eradicated. Nora's world, once so precarious, was now irrevocably, terrifyingly safe. The alley was quiet once more, the only sounds the pounding rain and the heavy, measured breaths of Gabriel's men. He stood tall amidst the fallen, a formidable figure in the storm, his strength absolute. Then he turned fully to Nora, his powerful body now facing her, his intense gaze locking onto hers. Rain plastered his dark hair to his forehead, streamed down his face, but his eyes, dark and ancient, held a clarity that pierced through the chaos. "It is done, Nora," he rumbled, his voice deep and solemn, yet with an underlying current of absolute authority. He paused, his eyes searching hers, demanding a profound understanding. "All who dared to threaten you, all who stood against my claim are gone. The danger is erased. You are safe." He took a slow, deliberate step closer, his hand reaching out, his large fingers gently brushing the velvet collar necklace at her throat, a soft, possessive touch that sent a shiver through her. "Now," he continued, his voice softer, yet still commanding, "I offer you a choice. A true choice, unburdened by fear or threat." His gaze was unwavering, intense. "I can annul our marriage. I can set you up, far from this city, far from my world, with a new life, absolute freedom, and resources beyond anything you could imagine. You would never see me or my shadows again." Nora's breath hitched. Freedom. The word hung in the air, a dazzling, terrifying concept. A life without fear, without his demanding presence, without the constant awareness of his dangerous world. A part of her, the old Nora, yearned for it, ached for the simplicity, the quiet independence she had always known. But another part, the part that had blossomed under his formidable protection, recoiled. To be alone again. To face the world without his shield, without his absolute certainty. The thought was more terrifying than any of the violence she had just witnessed. His terrifying power had become her most profound comfort, his possessiveness her deepest safety. She looked at him, at his rain-streaked, powerful face, seeing not just the MAFIA king, but the man who had watched over her for years, who had taken a bullet for her, who had orchestrated this brutal reckoning for her sake. This wasn't just a claim, it was a devotion, dark and absolute. She didn't hesitate. Without a word, without a moment of doubt, she stepped out from behind him, out from the literal shadow of his protection, and moved into his chest, pressing herself against him, her arms circling his powerful waist. She buried her face in his rain-soaked suit jacket, inhaling the scent of him, of ozone and rain, and something uniquely, powerfully him. "No, Gabriel," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, filled with a love and devotion so profound it stole her breath. "I don't want to go. I want to stay. I want to be your wife for real." His arms tightened around her, a possessive, powerful embrace that lifted her slightly off her feet. It was a silent, absolute acknowledgement, a triumph that resonated through her very soul. She was his, utterly and irrevocably, and in his fierce, unyielding hold, Nora Thorne knew she was finally, truly, home. The torrential rain had finally ceased, leaving New Orleans glistening under a fragile morning sun. But the quiet that followed the storm was not one of peace, but of consolidation. Nora felt it in the very air, a shift in the city's pulse. Gabriel's power, once formidable and feared, was now absolute. The underworld, a shadowy entity she rarely saw but keenly sensed, knew his name with a new kind of reverence, a terror that extended to every corner, and they knew her name too. Nora Thorne, his queen. She had heard snippets from his men, hushed conversations that implied the swift, brutal aftermath. Gabriel had left no loose ends, no lingering threats. The trafficking ring was shattered, its remnants scattered to the winds or simply extinguished. Her ex, the clinic director, gone. A chilling finality that, despite its darkness, had brought her an unimaginable peace. No one dared to challenge Gabriel, and by extension, no one dared to even glance at her with ill intent. She was sacred, untouchable, wrapped in the impenetrable cloak of his authority. Nora thrived in this new life, a vibrant bloom in the heart of Gabriel's dark empire. The constant anxiety that had been her shadow for years had finally lifted, replaced by a profound, unwavering security. Her days, once a treadmill of exhaustion and worry, were now filled with a strange, luxurious purpose. She spent hours in the vast library, losing herself in books, or walked the enclosed gardens, the scent of jasmine heavy in the air, always with the silent, watchful presence of Gabriel's men. She was cherished, protected, and in a way that defied all logic, deeply loved. Gabriel's love wasn't soft or overtly tender, but it was a fierce, possessive devotion, absolute and unyielding. It was in the way his eyes tracked her across a room, a silent claim that warmed her from the inside out. It was in the way her favorite obscure tea appeared without her asking, or the way he would subtly adjust the thermostat because he knew she got cold easily. These were his quiet acts of affection, a language Nora now understood perfectly, a testament to how deeply he saw her, how completely he cared. Her role as his wife, once forced, was now a willing embrace, a profound fulfillment. She didn't have to make decisions, didn't have to carry burdens. Gabriel handled everything, his strength a vast ocean in which she could finally, truly, float. She found an unexpected strength in this submission, a quiet power in being the undisputed center of his world. She was the calm at the heart of his storm, the one person for whom his formidable power was always irrevocably bent. The Gothic mansion, once a gilded cage, had transformed into their sanctuary. Its heavy stone walls, its intricate wrought-iron balconies, now felt less like a prison and more like an eternal embrace. Gabriel's world remained dark and dangerous, a labyrinth of power and shadows she knew little about. But within these walls, within their shared space, there was an intimate comfort she had never known. He remained demanding, his presence overwhelming, his authority absolute. There was no question of who commanded, yet his actions, his every command, were filtered through his fierce protectiveness. If he asked her where she wanted to dine, it was not an open question, but an invitation for her to express a preference within the confines of his careful planning for her safety. If he asked her to wear a certain dress, it was because he wanted her adorned as his queen, a display of his pride in her, a declaration of his ownership. It was a language Nora now fully understood and, to her surprise, deeply appreciated. She would often sit with him in his study in the evenings, not speaking, just existing in the quiet hum of his powerful presence. He would be engrossed in his work, but his hand would often reach out, finding hers, his fingers intertwining with hers, a silent tether. The velvet collar necklace, always at her throat, was no longer a symbol of being taken, but of being cherished, a precious jewel in his undisputed reign. She was Nora Thorne, the woman who had given food to a beggar, and who had in turn been given a world where she was finally, absolutely and forever safe, cherished and loved by her dangerous king. Months later, the morning sun poured through the wide windows of the gleaming free clinic, a stark contrast to the charity clinic Nora had once known. This new building, state-of-the-art and meticulously maintained, hummed with a quiet efficiency. Nora, no longer the weary nurse haunted by shadows, moved through its bright halls with a poise she hadn't known she possessed. Her uniform was crisp, her stride confident, and her heart, once burdened by endless anxieties, now felt light, filled with a profound sense of purpose. Gabriel had built this for her, a sanctuary where she could heal and help, a testament to his silent, unwavering understanding of her deepest desires. Each morning, a sleek black car, its windows tinted, would deliver her to the clinic's entrance. She would step out, a velvet collar necklace, a soft, familiar weight at her throat, a visible sign of her belonging. She never saw them, not truly, but she felt the watchful presence of Gabriel's men. They were shadows, always there, ensuring her absolute safety, her peace. She was never truly alone, never vulnerable. This constant unseen vigilance, once unnerving, had become her most profound comfort. The world beyond the clinic's doors, the world of threats and danger, was held at bay by Gabriel's formidable will, allowing her to focus entirely on the healing she brought to others. Gabriel remained the feared Mafia king of New Orleans, his power unchallenged, his network vast and ruthlessly efficient. She knew his world still existed, a dark undercurrent beneath the city's vibrant facade. She sometimes caught snippets of news, hushed whispers from his men, that hinted at the brutal consolidation of his power, the silent eradication of any who dared to rise against him. But this violence, these shadows, were meticulously kept from her. They were his work, the harsh realities he navigated so that she could exist in light. His ruthlessness was her shield, his iron fist her protection. As dusk settled, casting long shadows across the city, the black car would return, carrying her back to the mansion. The Gothic riverfront estate, once a gilded cage, was now simply home, a sanctuary of profound peace. The heavy stone walls, the intricate wrought-iron balconies felt like an eternal embrace, holding the world at bay. One evening, Nora found Gabriel in the kitchen, a rare sight. He stood by the gleaming industrial stove, barefoot, a simple apron tied around his lean hips, stirring something in a large pot. The scent of rich herbs and simmering tomatoes filled the air, a domestic scene that felt almost surreal. But as he reached for a spice jar, the dark fabric of his trousers shifted, and Nora caught a glimpse of the small, familiar bulge of a concealed gun, always within reach. It was a silent promise of eternal vigilance, a reminder that even in their most intimate moments, the dangerous king remained, ready to protect his queen. He turned, his dark eyes meeting hers, a subtle smile playing on his lips. "Dinner is almost ready, Nora," he rumbled, his voice a deep, warm current that flowed through her, chasing away any lingering weariness from her day. It was a command, yes, but one steeped in care, in a possessive tenderness that now defined their life. She walked towards him, her steps light, and placed her hand on his arm, feeling the solid warmth of his skin beneath her touch. He pulled her closer, his arms encircling her waist, drawing her against his powerful chest. She rested her head against him, inhaling the scent of him, of spices and something uniquely, powerfully masculine. His heart beat a steady, strong rhythm beneath her ear, a constant, reassuring drum. His fingers, large and warm, gently brushed the velvet collar necklace at her throat, a soft, possessive caress. It gleamed softly in the lamplight, a tangible symbol of her belonging. She was safe, cherished, and utterly, irrevocably his. In his fierce, unyielding hold, Nora Thorne, the woman who had given food to a beggar, had found her world, her purpose, and her most powerful guardian. She was his beloved queen, forever. If you enjoyed this story, tell us where you're watching from and subscribe to Tales of Power and Desire to keep up with our intense romances.